The morning sun stretched over the village of Dashtan like a gentle hand, warming the earth and drawing ribbons of light through the acacia trees. It was the kind of morning that made the old women hum as they swept their thresholds and the bakers whistle as they kneaded dough. The air smelled of rising bread, wet clay and something sweet, cardamom most likely, spilling from the sack beside the spice stall where Lala sat cross-legged, counting lentils in neat little rows. Her father's voice echoed faintly from the far side of the market. He was laughing. A short, soft laugh, the kind he made when arguing with someone who thought a scraped knee needed more than water and patience. He was likely scolding someone for overboiling willow bark again. Lala smiled without looking up. She knew his routines. Kian the healer, the gentle man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that never looked away when someone was in pain. He made no enemies. He had nothing anyone would want, save perhaps the recipes he kept in his leather-bound journal and the trust of a village that often forgot how fragile peace was. That morning, everything felt intact. Children chased chickens across the square. A woman argued with her sister about how many eggs went into dough for breadsticks. The mosque bell clanged once, the signal for the 9th hour, and Lala sighed. She was supposed to have fetched water by now. Then the dust rose at the village gate. She noticed it first, a strange gray cloud rolling in low and fast, cutting across the narrow road. A moment later, others saw it too. Someone said, "Carriage?" Another said, "No, horses." But Lala's eyes narrowed. The color of the dust was wrong, darker, too thick. It wasn't just horses. It was armor. They came like thunder with metal skin, breaking the silence with hooves and the sharp bark of orders. Soldiers. Not village guards, not tax collectors, but real soldiers, trained and hard-eyed, cloaked in black and red, their boots already coated in dust before they even entered the square. In the middle of them rode a man no one recognized, tall, wrapped in a storm-gray cloak. His eyes were pale. Too pale. Like something had scraped the color from them. He rode without helmet or banner, but every soldier kept glancing his way as if to confirm his presence. Lala felt her skin tighten. She had never seen soldiers this close. She had never seen people move aside like this, not with fear but the kind that clings to the throat and refuses to be swallowed. The man dismounted. The soldiers fanned out wordlessly. Then he spoke. "Where is the healer?" Lala blinked. The words didn't make sense. Then she heard her father answer. "I am here." Kian stepped forward, wiping his hands on a cloth that was already stained with turmeric and ink. He did not look frightened, only puzzled. He looked at the commander as one would look at a stranger asking for directions, wary but not hostile. "I heard someone was unwell," he added. The commander did not respond. He raised his hand. From behind him, 2 soldiers stepped forward, dragging something heavy between them, a body wrapped in crimson silk, embroidered with the seal of House Archon. A nobleman. Dead. A murmur spread like rot through the air. The commander pointed to the body. "This man died 3 days ago. Vomiting black. Bleeding from his mouth." A report was sent. "Our apothecaries found traces of cinder twine and bloodroot." He turned his pale eyes to Kian. "Your recipes, are they not?" Kian opened his mouth, closed it, then said slowly, "Cinder twine is used for blood clotting. Bloodroot only in tiny doses." "Enough." The commander gestured, and in a breath, 6 soldiers surrounded Kian. One struck him behind the knees with the hilt of his sword. He fell. The square erupted into chaos. Lala froze behind her stall. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But her body felt carved in stone. Her hands were still full of lentils. They spilled slowly like rain. "I've healed your kind before," Kian said, gasping. "Ask anyone here." "No need," the commander said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't threaten. It simply was. Final. Judgment has already been passed. They dragged Kian to the square's old fig tree, the one that had not borne fruit in years but still cast the longest shadow. 2 soldiers pulled rope from their saddlebags. Another carried a stool. There was no priest. No reading of crimes. Just movements, mechanical and cold. A woman screamed. Lala realized it was her. Or maybe not. She couldn't tell anymore. Her legs still wouldn't move. Her father didn't struggle. He looked into the crowd, not searching, not pleading. Just looking. His eyes flicked past faces he'd known since he was a boy. Some wept. Some turned away. None stepped forward. Lala saw him look once toward her stall. He couldn't see her, she was hidden in shadow, tucked behind a barrel of dried saffron stems. But he looked anyway. He smiled. And that was when the commander kicked the stool. The rope snapped tight. The fig tree creaked. and Lala's world shrank into silence. Later, she didn't know how much later, a hand pulled her from behind the stall. She had been found. The commander stood over her, his mouth a thin, hard line. "Leave her," one soldier muttered. "She's just a child." "No," the commander said. "She's his." He looked at her like he was studying something on a page. "Bring her." She didn't struggle. There was nothing left to pull against. They didn't take her far, just to the edge of the square where their wagons waited. She expected to be executed. But instead the commander knelt before her. "You will work. You'll serve. It is mercy." He said the word like it tasted wrong in his mouth. "Your hands will cook for me," he added. "If you poison me, I'll know. If you try to run, you'll regret it more than he did." He didn't wait for a response. He rose, gave the order, and left. She was loaded onto the back of a cart between two crates of barley. No one followed. No one tried to stop them. The fig tree still stood. The body still swung. As the village faded behind her, Lala stared at the rope. It had frayed already. Her father's weight had worn through the fibers. But the branch had not broken. In her lap, her hand clenched into a fist, and she realized she had pocketed one of the lentils. A single red one. Misshapen. Bitter. She gripped it tight. And let the cart carry her into the beginning of her silence. The wheels of the cart groaned through the dry earth, pulling Lala farther from the village with each jolt. The village gate had vanished behind a bend hours ago, but her body still felt the heat of those last stairs, faces pressed to doorframes, wide eyes behind curtains, the soundless guilt of people who had once eaten her father's food and touched his hands for healing. No one had tried to save her. And yet she was alive. Not free. Just alive. Her hands had been bound with a soft rope, knotted not tight enough to bruise, but firm enough to remind her that her freedom now belonged to the man who ordered her father's hanging. The one they called General Damon. The man she would now cook for. She had not spoken a word since the square. Not when they fed her dry bread in a soldier's tent. Not when the cart was loaded. Not when the man who slit her father's life from the world said, "You'll serve with quiet hands or you'll bleed like he did." She had nothing to say. Only the words of her father remained. His notes, his small, bound journal of recipes and medicine that she had hidden deep in the folds of her clothes. They hadn't searched her. No one expected a girl to be carrying anything but grief. They passed no other travelers. Dust followed them like a second shadow. The landscape began to change. Trees twisted taller, the sky darkened with strange clouds, and birds flew higher overhead, as though even they knew to stay away from the place they were going. When they reached the estate, it wasn't what she had imagined. There were no gilded columns or marble courtyards. No flowers. Just long walls of gray stone, covered in thorny vines and towers like broken teeth. It looked less like a home and more like a place where light came to die. The gates opened without sound. And still no one spoke to her. She was escorted to the side of the main building, past a row of dead trees and a line of servants who never lifted their eyes. A woman met her at the door, tall, thin, with eyes like cracked glass. She said only one thing. "You will wake before the sun and sleep after it dies." Then turned. Lala followed. The room they gave her was little more than a cell. A cot, a chipped bowl, and a small hearth with no fire. But there was a window, thin and narrow, just wide enough to see the sky. She sat on the edge of the cot and waited for night. That night, when the wind blew in cold and sharp, she finally reached into her sleeve and pulled out the book. Her father's journal. The edges were stained, the leather worn from use. The pages inside carried his careful hand, rows of script so precise it looked printed. He had always written like a man who knew time was running short. She flipped past the familiar sections: tonics for fever, teas for memory, a paste for burns made from crushed violet root, and found the pages near the back, the ones he'd stopped letting her read aloud after she turned 12. These were different. The ink was darker. The lines were shorter, tighter, as if written in haste or fear. Recipes mixed with notes, symbols she didn't recognize. There were drawings of herbs she'd never seen in the village, ones that bloomed only during eclipses or in graveyard soil. And in the margins, faint but still legible, were small words scratched in with red ink. To reveal the guilt of the tongue. Memory root plus marrow vine equals sorrow made liquid. To serve is not to surrender. Sometimes the hand that cooks is the hand that heals, or breaks. And on the last page, if he ever returns, feed him the fifth. No explanation. Just that. Feed him the fifth. She didn't know what it meant. Not yet. A soft knock at the door pulled her from the page. A small girl no older than 10, slipped inside, her eyes wide with fear. She handed Lala a bundle wrapped in linen. Bread. A hard egg. A piece of dried meat. Then the girl pointed to the bowl and motioned to wash. Lala nodded. The girl paused as if wanting to speak. But whatever she'd meant to say stayed buried behind her lips. She turned and left without a sound. In the dim silence, Lala stared at the food. Then she opened her father's book again and began to read. The days that followed bled into one another, stitched together by heat and silence. She rose before the sun, swept the kitchen floors, peeled vegetables for the general's meals, cleaned blood from his boots. She washed laundry, folded uniforms, stirred pots too large for her arms to carry, and kept her head bowed. No one beat her. No one praised her. She was invisible. But she listened. And in her quiet she learned. The estate had 24 soldiers, but they rarely spoke to the general directly. Food was always sent up on silver trays, never by hand. Whispers swirled in the hallways, that he no longer trusted anyone to touch him, that he barely slept, that something followed him at night like a ghost he refused to name. The servants walked like they were being watched. Lala memorized every hallway, every creak of the floorboards, every locked door. She also began gathering herbs. Some from the kitchen, others from the overgrown garden near the stables. A few from the cracks in the walls, dark green moss that smelled of copper and almonds, roots that broke through stone in places they shouldn't. She pressed them into the pages of her father's book, making notes in the margins. One evening, while scrubbing an old pantry, she found a loose stone. Behind it, tucked carefully in cloth, was a tiny glass jar filled with dried petals. Purple. With dark red veins. Sorrow root. She knew the name from her father's journal. He had circled it once in red. She returned to her room and opened the book again. The fifth. 5 recipes listed at the front of the strange section. The 5th one was short. A broth of bone and sorrow root. Sweeten with dates. Thicken with marrow. Serve only once. When the soul is cracked, this will let the truth slip free. She traced the words with her finger. The next morning she asked to be assigned to the general's breakfast. No one questioned her. She prepared the meal slowly, carefully, a thick soup of lamb bone, dates, a dash of black pepper, and 1 crushed petal stirred in at the last moment. She did not pray. She did not hope. She only watched. When the tray was taken, she listened from behind the hallway wall. Then coughing. Then when the tray was taken, she listened from behind the hallway wall. There was no crash. No scream. Just silence again. That night the general did not come down. The next morning his boots were not left by the door. And yet, someone whispered that they heard him pacing. The following evening one of the older maids, hunched with time and dust, approached Lala near the hearth. "You're his new girl?" she said. Her voice was cracked, brittle. Lala nodded. The woman studied her. Then placed a finger on Lala's chest, right over her heart. "You have his eyes." "My father?" "No. The general." The old woman spat the word like it was a worm. "His eyes were like yours once. Before they turned to bone." Then she walked away. Lala stood there for a long time. Then returned to her room. And wrote 3 words in her father's journal. "He is cracking. Not broken. Not yet. But cracking." And that, she knew, was where all endings began. The estate was colder than any stone Lala had ever touched. It wasn't just the air, though that was always chilled even beneath the noon sun, it was the way the walls breathed silence. Nothing echoed. Even footsteps seemed swallowed, muffled beneath heavy wood beams and thick drapes stained the color of rust. Fireplaces were built into every room but none of them ever crackled. The hearths remained cold, the soot undisturbed. No one dared light them. It was a place made for punishment, not comfort. Lala had been there for nearly 2 weeks before she heard the general's voice again. It came through the ceiling like a dying echo, raspy, sharp, not in command but in confusion. "Who put this on my desk?" Then a slam. Then silence. The servant who carried the tray never returned to the kitchen. When Lala asked another maid about her, the woman just shook her head. "Gone to the back wing," she whispered. "No one comes back from the back wing." That was the kind of place it was. Damon ruled it like a ghost chained to his own corridors, rarely seen, never touched. The few who brought food to his study said he looked thinner now. His eyes, once frightening in their clarity, had become foggy around the edges. He paced. He stared out of windows that no longer looked onto gardens but to a crumbling field of dust and thorns. Some nights, a low thump could be heard, like fists against walls. Some said he spoke in his sleep. Some said he screamed. Lala listened to it all. She kept to her duties, cleaning, sorting, cutting, boiling. But slowly she began to claim the kitchen not just with her hands but with her memory. She touched the jars as if they could whisper. She held herbs in her palm like a second language. Salt, cumin, dried mint. Crushed almonds. Fig vinegar. She measured, yes, but not just for flavor. Her fingers weighed grief and time. She tasted ash where there was none. And when no one watched, she opened her father's journal again. The back pages still hummed with meaning. Symbols that pulsed faintly beneath the candlelight. Her father had believed food could do more than nourish. He had once said, "The right root in the right hand at the right hour can turn a coward into a confessor." Now she believed him. She began choosing what to serve Damon with quiet intent. A barley stew, earthy and grounding, with a sprig of sleep blossom, a herb that blurred dreams and sharpened guilt. Flatbread with inkseed oil, good for opening the throat and softening hard speech. Dried lemon stirred into tea, a fruit her father said carried memory better than any ink. No one noticed, except, perhaps, Damon himself. Because soon after she began preparing his meals, the general's study was no longer locked at night. One morning, while scrubbing the floor of the main hall, Lala saw the door slightly ajar. The room inside smelled not of ink and sweat, but smoke and something stranger, like scorched metal and regret. She didn't go inside. But she knew something was shifting. The servants, meanwhile, grew more distant. They spoke less. They stepped around her as if she were already half invisible. One man crossed himself when she passed. Another left a bowl of salt outside her door. She asked the same old maid again, "Why do they look at me like that?" The woman didn't answer at first. Then she leaned closer and whispered, "He chose you. Not the way a man chooses a bride. The way a man chooses a knife he doesn't understand." Lala's blood turned cold. Still she cooked. Still she waited. And still, each night, she copied more of the symbols from her father's journal onto the underside of serving trays, into the dust behind bottles, in flower patterns that disappeared as soon as the dough rose. One day, while in the herb garden, a neglected patch near the rear of the estate where nothing should have grown, she found something strange. A red bloom. Sharp-petaled, small and bright as a burn. She recognized it immediately. Emberroot. Her father had written about it once. Feeds on guilt. Grows only where blood has touched earth. She plucked it and pressed it between pages. That evening she made lentil soup. She added the smallest shaving of emberroot. And as she stirred, she whispered one of her father's phrases. "Let what is buried rise, not in body but in breath." The tray was delivered in silence. Later that night she heard movement. Not footsteps, but the dragging of a chair. Then the soft knock of glass tipping to the floor. And then the most terrible sound of all, a sob. Not loud. Not wild. Just broken. Like something that had not been used in years cracking open for the first time. In the morning the tray returned untouched, except for the soup which was gone. After that the general stopped sending for meat. He requested lighter meals. Broths. Herbal teas. And then once a note. The soup again. With lemon. Lala smiled for the first time since her father died. Days passed. Each meal became a dialogue, silent but deep. She replied with spices. He answered with requests. She introduced a tea brewed with morning bark. He sent back the empty cup and a gold coin. They never spoke. But she knew. Something inside him was unraveling. One night, a storm rolled over the estate, heavy winds, bright flashes. Thunder cracked above the hills like a whip. The servants cowered. But Lala stood in the kitchen, brewing a batch of spiced milk with 3 drops of whispervine extract. She poured it into a glass mug, set it on the tray and walked the steps herself. When she reached the general's study, the door opened before she knocked. He stood there hollow-eyed, wrapped in a thick cloak despite the heat. He didn't speak. Just stepped aside. Lala entered. The room was in shambles, books everywhere, scrolls torn, glass broken on the floor. In the center stood a painting she hadn't seen before, its cover pulled back. A portrait of a younger Damon, clean-shaven, laughing beside a man she recognized instantly. Her father. Ghanian. They had known each other. She turned slowly to the general. His hands were trembling. "Why did you come tonight?" he rasped. She said nothing. Just handed him the mug. He took it. Sip. Then drank more. "I haven't slept in 7 nights, he whispered. Still she said nothing. Your father was my friend. What? Before the war. Lala's eyes burned. He stared into the fireless hearth. I came to the village for revenge. For a poison I thought he brewed. I was wrong. But I couldn't say that. Not with the court watching. He turned to her then, eyes raw and bloodshot. I had to hang someone. The words landed like stones in her stomach. He drained the mug. Set it down. Your food does something to me, he said. It makes me remember. Lala lowered her eyes. Then turned and walked away. She didn't cry. Not until she reached the hallway. That night she returned to her room and pulled the journal close. She wrote nothing. Just stared at the page her father had marked with the words, "Feed him the fifth." She understood now. It was never about poison. It was never about death. It was about truth. Truth that could not be hidden beneath armor or law. Truth that came in steam, in spice, in the warmth of a bowl held with shaking hands. In the days that followed, the estate shifted. The fires were lit again. The servants spoke more freely. The garden began to bloom with herbs long thought dead. But no one approached Lala. They watched her. They respected her. And some began to fear her. Because they did not understand how she had broken him. They only knew one thing. Since she began to cook for the man who killed her father, he no longer ordered anyone's death. He only ate. And remembered. Lala stood at the center of the kitchen, her hands steady as they moved over the wooden table worn smooth by years of use. The knife she held was her father's. She had found it buried beneath a sack of rotting onions in the corner of the pantry. She'd known it the moment she saw the hilt, carved with the shape of a spiral root, polished dark with age as if it still carried his fingerprints. Tonight, the general had asked for a full dinner. Not stew. Not broth. A proper feast. Make it like it's a holiday, the steward said, avoiding her eyes. He says he wants a celebration. He didn't say for what. Lala nodded. She already knew. It had been 40 days since the hanging. 40 days since her father's last breath turned to wind. In their village it was the day when mourning was supposed to end. But Lala had no intention of letting anything end. Not yet. She tied her hair with a plain cloth and lit the fires herself. The kitchen hissed to life. She brought out the flour, the vinegar, the cloves, the apricots dried under last year's sun, the meat marinated in lemon and turmeric, the rice soaked in saffron water so long it glowed. And then, from the folds of her father's journal, she pulled a paper-thin bundle of dried green leaves. Zahir root. It had taken her weeks to find. Her father's notes on it were minimal but clear, used only in truth rites. Should not be inhaled. Must never be boiled. Activated by flame. She crushed the smallest piece between her fingers and smelled it, earthy like rain-soaked wood, but laced with something sharp like metal or memory. He had written only one instruction beside the name. Truth is not what we say, it is what we remember when we eat. She folded the powdered leaf into the spice mix that would coat the lamb. The aroma bloomed as it cooked, deep and sweet but layered with something else. Something older. She prepared rosewater syrup for the rice. Pomegranate seeds like drops of blood. Bread as thin as silk. Everything placed in silver trays, wiped until they gleamed. At sunset, the steward returned to collect the dishes. He paused when he saw the full spread. She cooked like this for your father, didn't she? He asked. Lala didn't answer. She only handed him the tray. The meal went up the stairs. Lala cleaned the kitchen, washed the floors and returned to her room. But she didn't sleep. Not yet. She waited. Hours passed. The estate grew silent. Then, just before the moon reached its peak, she slipped from her cot and crept through the hallway barefoot. She moved like smoke, light, unnoticeable, unafraid. Her body had memorized the quiet already. The stones didn't creak under her. She stopped outside the general's chamber. The door was shut but not locked. She crouched beside it, pressing her ear to the wood. Inside she heard the rustle of sheets. A grunt. Then muttering. She held her breath. The words came broken, thick with sleep and fever. No. Not Kian. I told them it wasn't him. Her fingers twitched. Kian. Her father's name. Another voice, his own, rasped through the door. I didn't want this. I didn't. Then a sound like weeping. But not the kind that begged for comfort. The kind that came when a wall cracked and couldn't be rebuilt. She stayed there until the sound stopped. Not for comfort. For confirmation. Then she stood and walked away. By the time the sun rose, Lala had already begun preparing breakfast. A light meal. No spices today. Just honeyed flatbread and mint tea, soothing, soft. She sent it up. And waited. This time no tray came back. Hours passed. The steward didn't appear. No orders were sent. By mid-afternoon, a maid whispered that the general hadn't left his chamber. By evening, word spread through the estate that he'd collapsed. Too much wine, someone muttered. His mind is broken, said another. Lala listened, but said nothing. That night, she sat alone in the kitchen, her hands curled around her father's knife, and read the last page of his journal again. There, in a slanted script different from the rest, were words she hadn't noticed before, faint, faded by time, perhaps written in haste. The one who eats the truth must be willing to remember it, or it will destroy them. She closed the book and stared into the cold hearth. 2 days passed. Damon did not leave his chambers. No meals were requested. No soldiers knocked on her door. But Lala felt a tension gathering, like threads being pulled tighter around the estate. Servants moved with sharper urgency. Candles burned lower. The walls seemed to breathe harder, like something inside them had been disturbed and now refused to go back to sleep. On the 3rd day, the steward appeared in the kitchen. "His Grace is awake," he said, voice tight. "He requests your cooking." Lala didn't nod, didn't smile, just began to cook. A simple lentil stew flavored with cumin and garlic. No zahirut. Not this time. She sent the tray without ceremony. By nightfall he sent a note in return. "Tell me what was in the lamb." She burned the note in the fire. Later that night she heard footsteps outside her door. Pause. Then retreating silence. He was afraid. Good. She returned to the journal. Not to read. Just to hold it. Its weight grounded her. She thought of her father's hands, his laugh, the way he said her name when he was proud of her. She thought of the words written beside the zahirut. "Memory is a meal we all must swallow." The next morning she was summoned, not to the kitchen but to the garden behind the estate. When she arrived, she found Damon sitting on the edge of the dry fountain. His hair was grayer than she remembered. His armor gone. Just plain robes. His hands rested on his knees, knuckles pale. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Only when the wind shifted did he raise his eyes. "They say you're like him," he said. She didn't ask who. "They said he could cure a fever with 2 leaves and a song. That his tea made you speak your truth whether you wanted to or not." He looked down at the cracked stone under his feet. "I hated him," he said, "because I feared he knew something I didn't." Silence. Then, "What was in the lamb?" Lala stared at him. "It wasn't poison," she said softly. He looked up. "It was memory." He closed his eyes. After a long moment he whispered, "I saw my mother, my brother, the first man I ever killed. I saw myself giving the order, the noose around his neck, and knowing it was wrong." A long aching pause. "Why did you do it?" She didn't answer at first. Then voice flat, "To feed the hunger you buried." He laughed once, a short, bitter sound. "You could have killed me." She met his eyes. "I still could." Another pause. Then he said, "I'll give you anything. The estate. A house. Freedom." She stepped forward. "I don't want gifts. I want your memory to burn." He didn't speak again. Lala turned and left him there, seated on stone, surrounded by nothing but wind. That night, she returned to her room and tore the page with the zahirut recipe from her father's journal. She set it on fire and let the ashes fall into a cup of water. Then she drank it, not to forget, but to carry it forward. Memory was not just for vengeance. It was for restoration. And she would never forget again. The sun had not yet risen when Lala slipped into the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. Morning was her sanctuary, the only time the estate still felt like it might hold warmth. The walls had not yet remembered what they were, a prison dressed in linen and gold. The other servants were still asleep or at least pretending to be. She preferred it that way. Silence helped her think, helped her read. She unwrapped her father's journal from the bundle of cloth hidden in the flour sack. The pages smelled like thyme and smoke. She flipped to the middle section, past the stained drawings of roots and spoons, past the coded entries where recipes and incantations danced side by side. Then to the section with more recent additions, written shakily, urgently in his final days. There were meals here, yes, but not meant to nourish. They were designed to do something else entirely. She traced her fingers over the ink. Soup of recall. 3 herbs steeped over flame before dusk. Must be served with something sweet or memories may turn bitter. Her father never called them spells. That would have been too dangerous. Too obvious. He called them dishes of weight. Meant to restore or break depending on intent. And in the wrong hands they could do harm. Or worse, wake something buried. You read like your father used to, came a voice from behind her. She didn't flinch. She'd felt him before he spoke, the way dust stirs before a breeze. The old man stood near the doorframe, leaning slightly on a cane that looked older than the estate. His name was Moshid. He had been sweeping the hallways since before Lala was born. No one paid him much attention, and that was exactly how he liked it. You knew him? She asked. Moshid nodded. Your father once cooked a meal that made a soldier return home from war with tears in his eyes. He made lentils taste like a mother's lullaby. Lala closed the book. He never taught me. He was going to, Moshid said softly. He had just begun writing that journal for you. They sat at the table then, just the two of them, amid baskets of dried fruit and unlabeled jars. Lala poured warm tea from a copper kettle, added mint from her hidden stash. Moshid sipped it with a sigh. He used to say that every ingredient has a shadow. Not just a flavor but a memory. She nodded. I felt it. He leaned forward, voice barely a breath. Do you know what he used to say about basil? Lala shook her head. It remembers grief. Mix it with saffron and it can make even a murderer weep. Mix it with honey and it can bring clarity to someone lost. Moshid pulled a small cloth bundle from his robe. Inside were a few dried petals and a strip of parchment. On it, symbols she recognized from her father's journal. I kept this, he said, in case someone ever came looking. Lala's fingers trembled as she unfolded the note. It was a variation of something she had read before, but this one was clearer, more refined. Dish of clarity. Steeped lentils with basil, honey, and marrow root. To reveal hidden truth. Must be prepared under waning moon. Tonight the moon would wane. Lala felt her heartbeat deepen. She leaned over the table. Will you help me prepare it? Moshid didn't hesitate. Always. That evening, after the servants had cleared the supper dishes and the estate had sunk into quiet, they met again. Moshid brought tools from his quarters, a tiny mortar carved from black stone, a pestle worn smooth from decades of use, and a knife so thin it looked like it had been carved from bone. Lala lit 3 candles just as the recipe required. Then she began. She crushed the basil leaves slowly, listening to the sound. Like whispers. She added a touch of marrow root, a hint of clove. The honey was added last, warm and thick, folding over the bitterness. They cooked in silence, a rhythm passed down through memory rather than word. When it was done, Lala didn't serve it to anyone, not yet. She spooned a portion into a clay bowl and placed it in the hearth, near the cold ashes. Then she pressed her hand to her chest and whispered the name she had not said aloud in weeks. Ghanian. The name trembled in the air. The candle flame flickered blue. Moshid stood beside her, eyes closed. She would be proud of you, he said quietly. She. Your mother. She helped him build these recipes. She was a weaver but not of cloth. Of meanings. Lala swallowed. I don't remember her. You do, he said. Just not with your mind. Over the next several days, Lala continued reading and cooking. But now she had a partner. Moshid taught her how to listen for the signs. When steam curled in the shape of a question, when the scent of cardamom turned sharp, it meant the memory was resisting. One morning, they brewed a tea with night rose petals and found the entire kitchen filled with the smell of salt air. My parents met by the sea, Lala whispered. And just like that, the scent faded. She began making small adjustments to the general's meals. Nothing drastic. Just little things. Lavender steeped in broth for dreams. Bitter orange peel in his wine to surface suppressed truths. A glaze made from clover that encouraged confessions. She never wrote the changes down. She memorized each pattern. Each purpose. But then something changed. One night, she returned to her room to find a folded note on her pillow. No seal. No signature. Just a sentence. Why do your meals make me dream of fire? Her fingers clenched. He had noticed. Moshid warned her. Too much too soon and he will shut himself to it. Like a wound that scabs before it heals. But Lala wasn't afraid. She was careful. And the journal kept giving. One recipe, written in a trembling script, spoke of a dish called ashkidel, soup of the hidden heart. It required marrow, water from a river, and salt collected by hand. It was said to make the eater feel exactly what another felt at the time of cooking. She copied the recipe onto parchment. She wasn't ready to serve it yet, but one day she would. Late one night, Moshid brought her a folded cloth. Inside, a pendant shaped like an almond blossom. "It was your father's," he said. "He wore it when he cooked the dish that made your mother fall in love with him." Lala closed her hand around it. "What dish?" Moshid smiled. "Just lentils. But with fig and sumac." She laughed, soft and startled. So much had been lost. But now she was reclaiming it, one page, one herb, one flame at a time. The general might never know how much power passed through his mouth each night. But Lala would. And that was enough. For now. She tucked the pendant beneath her robe, kissed the corner of her father's journal, and began preparing the next recipe. Not of vengeance. Not yet. But of memory. The kind that roots deep. And never forgets. The fever began with a trembling in the general's hands. He dropped a spoon during breakfast. It clattered against the polished table, echoing too loudly in the great hall. Servants stiffened, eyes low. Damon waved it off, but Lala saw the sheen of sweat already forming at his temples, the twitch beneath his left eye. He didn't look at her as she cleared the table. That night he asked only for bread and tea. He did not eat the meat she had roasted with lemon balm and thyme. He did not touch the glazed squash or the soft rice with apricots. He pushed the tray away as though the food itself accused him. Lala said nothing. She only watched as he drank the tea she had prepared, a dark blend of hawthorn, valerian root, and a single drop of oil pressed from bitter seeds her father once called mirrors of the gut. They weren't meant to harm. Only to sharpen. To reflect. She returned to her room and waited. Before midnight she heard it. The scream. Sharp. Sudden. Guttural. Then the thud of something striking the wall. She didn't flinch. He had begun to remember. The next day the steward brought word that the general would not leave his room. "Tell the cook," he said, refusing to use her name, "that I want porridge. Only porridge. No meat. No spices. Nothing with herbs." The steward couldn't meet her eyes. Lala gave a small nod and prepared the porridge. But even that she laced with memory. A thin broth steeped in cloves and powdered bay root, barely noticeable on the tongue but enough to unravel old grief. She delivered it herself, walking the hallway like a shadow. The general's chambers were dark, the windows covered in thick velvet drapes. He sat on the edge of his bed, shirt clinging to his chest with sweat, eyes sunken, mouth drawn tight. His fingers twitched when he reached for the bowl. He didn't speak. He ate in silence. Each spoonful was slow, careful, as if he expected the food to bite back. She stood just long enough to see his throat move with the first swallow. Then she turned and left. Outside she heard his breath catch. And behind her, she thought she heard him whisper, "Not again." For the next week the illness stayed. Not a fatal one. No fever that burned bright and quick. This one lingered. Sunk into the bones. Dried the lips. Soured the air around him. He stopped eating anything solid. He refused wine. He rarely left his room. Some said he was cursed. Others whispered of poison. The servants grew uneasy. But Lala remained still, calm. She had read the signs in her father's journal. This was not poison. This was the reckoning the body gives itself when the soul begins to tremble. It was guilt made physical. Remorse had its own temperature. She continued to cook, carefully, deliberately. Soups with thyme for memory, barley to soften grief, dried orange peel to stir regret. Her father had written, "Those who forget must first taste what they buried. Then they will dream again." And Damon was dreaming. The steward said he spoke aloud at night now, fragments of things that didn't belong in a soldier's mouth. "I buried him myself. There were 3, not 2. She held the child. I told them not to shoot." Lala listened. Each word confirmed it. Each whisper strengthened her purpose. One afternoon, the steward entered the kitchen with trembling hands. "He's asking for you," he said. Lala wiped her hands on a towel and followed. This time she knocked. Come, said a rasp. Inside, the general sat on the floor. Not the bed. Not the chair. The floor, back against the wall, hair damp, eyes dull. He looked like a man who'd walked too long in the wrong direction and only just realized it. I saw your father again last night, he said, voice thin. Lala said nothing. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. Still she said nothing. He looked up at her, throat working. You're doing this. She lifted an eyebrow. The food. The dreams. He was almost pleading now. Why? She stepped forward, slowly, and placed a bowl of broth beside him. This one was gentler, made with wild mint and chamomile. A recipe her father had once called mercy for the mouth. You asked for mercy, she said softly. Mercy? He snapped. Is this mercy? She met his eyes. Would you prefer vengeance? He flinched, then leaned back against the wall. They said you were just a cook, he murmured. I am. He coughed once, then again. His hands trembled as he reached for the bowl. Do you know what we did? He asked. Yes, she said. He took a sip. His breath slowed. His eyes closed. Why don't you kill me? He whispered. She bent close. Because death would silence you. She stood and left. That night he did not scream. But the following morning, Lala found a note on her chopping board. In his handwriting. Just 3 words. What else remains? She didn't answer. Not yet. She flipped open her father's journal and turned to the last section. There, written in faint brown ink, was a recipe marked with a symbol she hadn't seen before. 2 overlapping hands, one light, one dark. The title, Ashki Zaman, The Tears of the Earth. To feed someone what they did not grieve, her father wrote, is to bring the storm back to their doorstep. The recipe was long. Intricate. It required dried rose hips, ash from a fire that burned for morning, and salt collected from one's own skin. She would need to wait for the right night. But it was coming. The fever had only begun. The worst was still ahead. And Lala would be ready. Rain lashed the windows like a warning. The shutters rattled against the wind, and the estate seemed smaller that night, colder, narrower, more like a cage than a home. Lala had just finished drying herbs by the kitchen hearth when the steward appeared at the door, soaked to the bone. He wants you, the man said, voice low, eyes avoiding hers. In the study. Now. She didn't ask why. She knew. The stew had already been simmering. She ladled it into a ceramic bowl, thick, dark, and fragrant. A dish of warmth, of comfort, laced with something older than either of them. Galberet, a rare leaf her father only used once. He called it the herb of haunting. Not poison. Not pain. Just memory made flesh. She carried the bowl through the hallway, the candlelight catching the steam as it rose like breath from a grave. Damon's study was dimly lit. A fire burned low in the hearth. He sat behind his great desk, shoulders hunched, fingers interlaced like a man praying to a god he didn't believe in. His face looked paler in the firelight, as if something had drained him slowly over the last weeks. The fever had not left. But tonight it had shifted into something sharper. You came, he said without looking up. Lala stepped forward and placed the bowl in front of him. You called. I wanted to ask you something, he murmured. Something about your father. She kept her face calm. What about him? He looked up then, eyes searching hers. What kind of man was he? The question was too gentle. Too late. She could have said 100 true things, about his laughter, his way with children, the songs he sang while grinding spices. But she said none of them. He believed in mercy, she replied, voice soft. Damon's mouth twitched. That's not what I heard. She tilted her head. And what did you hear? That he was stubborn. That he refused to kneel. That he told my men they would choke on their own greed. All those things can be true at once, she said. He nodded, slowly, then looked at the bowl. The steam still curled from its surface. What's in this? Stew, she said. Lamb. Root vegetables. Herbs for the storm. He picked up the spoon and began to eat. Slowly. One mouthful at a time. She sat in the chair across from him without being asked. The silence stretched. Then, somewhere beyond the windows, thunder rolled like a deep groan from the sky. Damon's hand paused. Did your father ever say anything about me? He asked. She blinked. No. A lie. A small one. A protective one. He put the spoon down and exhaled. I see him. Sometimes. She said nothing. In my sleep, he continued. He doesn't speak. He just watches me. His face is the same every time. Not angry. Not forgiving. Just watching. The fire hissed. The candle flickered. The room seemed to lean in closer. Then Damon's eyes unfocused. His mouth opened as if to speak, but the words dissolved. His hands gripped the edge of the table. Do you see them? He whispered. Lala's breath caught. He was no longer looking at her. His gaze had shifted, past her shoulder, into a shadow that wasn't there a moment ago. They're here, he said. His voice was barely audible now. All of them. The ones from the gully. The women at the well. The boy who ran. His eyes grew wide. My God. I told them to fire. I told them. His words fractured into sobs. I didn't know the boy was yours. I didn't know. He clutched at his chest, eyes wild. Then he screamed. Her father's name, full and clear. Not in anger, but in fear. Then again. And again. Louder each time, as though screaming could unmake the things he'd done. Lala stood. Come. Steady. She let him scream. Let him tremble. Let him see. And when he finally collapsed forward on the desk, gasping, the stew bowl empty beside him, she stepped quietly to the door. The rain had not stopped. But the night felt cleaner. Like something old had begun to break. And something older had just begun to rise. The fire had died down to its last embers by the time Lala returned to the study. She stepped in slowly, quietly, like someone entering a burial chamber. General Damon hadn't moved from the desk. He sat hunched over, head bowed, arms hanging limp at his sides like his bones were too tired to hold the guilt inside him anymore. The storm had passed. But the damage lingered. The air in the room felt cracked. She carried a small tray, a bowl of broth, a piece of warm bread wrapped in cloth, and a cup of steeped chamomile and ash bark. Her father had once called it a tea for regret, made not to ease pain, but to help someone sit still long enough to feel it. She placed the tray gently on the edge of the desk. Damon didn't look up. For a long time, there was no sound but the slow, shaking breath he pulled through his teeth. Finally he spoke. I knew he was innocent. The words weren't shaped like a confession. They were shaped like something falling. Still Lala said nothing. I knew it from the moment they brought him to me, he continued. He looked me in the eye and didn't beg. He didn't plead. He didn't curse me either. He just said, you know the truth. And I did. Lala looked at him then. His eyes were bloodshot. His face had sagged in the last week. Or maybe the last hour. The fever was still there but dulled now, its edge turned inward. He looked older than she remembered. Smaller. Almost human. His hands gripped the edge of the desk. There was unrest. Soldiers were nervous. People were starving. I needed someone to blame. Someone respected. Someone visible. You needed an example, she said. He nodded. I chose your father because I thought he'd take it quietly. That he wouldn't make a scene. And I was right. He didn't fight when we dragged him out. He didn't scream when they bound his hands. He didn't even look at me during the judgment. Because he already knew what you were, Lala said, voice like still water. Damon winced. I didn't know you were his daughter. Not until after. She raised an eyebrow. I swear it, he whispered. You were gone. Hidden. Your mother, she ran with you into the hills. I thought she died. She did, Lala said. Because of the winter. Because of the silence. Because no one would help a man's widow after you declared him traitor. He dropped his head. The tea steamed gently between them. I see him every night, Damon murmured. Not in anger. Just watching. It's worse than fury. You deserve worse, she said. He nodded again. I do. Pause. She stepped forward, pulled the bread from its cloth and placed it beside him. He stared at it like it was a verdict. I was going to kill myself last night, he admitted. After the visions. After I saw the boy in the river. Lala said nothing. I even held the dagger. He gestured to the drawer. But then I remembered how your father cooked. The smells. The stories. The way he made even bitter herbs taste sweet. He looked at her. And I realized, I don't want to die without understanding what I destroyed. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't offer pity. She pulled a stool near the fire and sat, wrapping her arms around her knees, watching the coals glow. Damon stared at her for a long moment. Will you forgive me? No, she said. It was not cruel. It was simple. Like naming a fact. But you'll feed me? She met his eyes. Yes. That too was a fact. He broke a piece of the bread and put it in his mouth. Chewed slowly. Something in his face softened, not redemption but recognition, like he had finally tasted the shape of his own shame. I buried him myself, he said again. Lala looked toward the fire. I know. I marked the grave. But I never visited it. You shouldn't, she said. Silence again. The kind that fills a house after the weeping stops. Then quietly she stood, collected the empty cup, took the tray. At the door she paused. I will keep feeding you, she said without turning. And you will keep speaking. Not because you deserve peace, but because the dead deserve to be remembered properly. He opened his mouth, but she was already gone. Back to the kitchen. Back to the journal. Back to her father's memory. Back to the fire, the salt, and the work. The journal had belonged to her father, but now it bore two hands, his and hers. Lala's writing was neater, slower. She had not rushed it. She never did. Her ink dried with precision, her words weighed like ingredients in a recipe. Her father had once said, truth, like salt, must be measured. Too little and it's bland. Too much and it burns. She opened to a fresh page. The rain had stopped outside, but the world still felt damp and waiting. She dipped the pen into ink and began. Entry 43, the final phase. He still breathes. He still eats. He walks the halls like a man searching for the rope he once tied around another's neck, forgetting he holds the other end. I have not fed him poison. Not in the way they think. There was no hemlock in the soup. No belladonna in the tea. No crushed glass in the bread. That would have been too simple. Too clean. Too much like what he gave my father. A swift sentence, a single grave, a silence. What I fed him was harder. Slower. More enduring. I fed him the smell of the past. A stew with the same spice blend my father used the last night he ever sang. The same root herb he dried while humming about warm winters and stubborn garlic. I let the general chew the flavors of a man he buried with his own hands. I fed him memory. Not just his own, but ours. Mine. The villages. The fields where my father taught children how to dig with their hands instead of carry weapons. I folded that memory into dumplings. I tucked it into teas. I crushed the weight of what was taken into something he could taste. I watched his eyes change with every bite. The fever was not from disease. It was from remembering. He sweated because the body doesn't know what to do with guilt once it enters the bloodstream. He asked me once if I hated him. I didn't answer, because hate would have made me fast. Rage makes the blade quick. What I wanted was not quick. What I wanted was for him to feel. So I fed him grief, softened by rosemary and wine, the kind that makes you weep in your sleep without knowing why. I fed him silence, seasoned with time, the herb of slowing breath, of making space inside the ribs where regret can sit without suffocating. I fed him clarity, brewed from bitter seeds and ash bark, known to crack illusions like thunder splits stone. And I fed him truth, piece by piece. Never too much. Never all at once. A sliver of memory in the broth. A forgotten song in the steam. A reflection in the glass that wasn't his. He began asking questions. That meant the recipes were working. He began whispering names he hadn't spoken in years. That meant the marrow of the guilt had softened. He confessed not to absolve himself, but because he couldn't carry the silence anymore. His body survives. But I can see the rot behind his eyes now. I can see the way he looks at his hands, wondering if they'll ever feel clean again. They won't. I never meant to kill him. I only wanted to unmake the lie he told himself to sleep at night. To taste what he took. To sit at the table with the ghost of the man he broke. And stay there. Alive. Where? Hungry only for peace he will never find. That is what I fed him. And I will keep feeding him. Until the last spoonful feels like forgiveness, and he realizes it will never come. The estate was quieter now than it had ever been. No guards. No carriages. No barked orders. The walls had softened with time, their hard edges worn down by wind and rain and the steady rhythm of growing things. Vines crept over old stone. Wildflowers pushed through cracks in the flagstones. The house, once a fortress of command and cruelty, had become something else entirely. In the back garden, Lala knelt in the dirt with her hands stained green and brown. Her father's herbs grew untamed now, tall and unruly, full of life and scent. Basil that twisted toward the sun like reaching fingers. Wild mint that hummed when the wind passed through it. Burdock root. Marjoram. A flowering plant no one else in the region dared grow, with leaves shaped like tongues and petals dark as plum wine. Lala knew every name. Every use. Every story. People came now, not from duty but hope. They traveled on foot, by cart, by rumor. Some came with wounds that wouldn't heal. Some came with hearts too heavy for their ribs. Some came with guilt trailing behind them like a hungry dog. They came for her food. Not for taste. Not for pleasure. But because something in it changed them. She fed them soup and watched their shoulders loosen. She served them stews that made old men cry. She brewed tea that made stubborn women admit their own cruelty. She did not ask what haunted them. She only handed them bowls and bread and a quiet place to sit. And when they finished, they almost always wept. Not from pain, but from recognition. Word spread, the girl who cooked memory into every bite. The woman who fed truth without ever speaking it aloud. They called her a healer, but she never claimed that name. She said she only followed her father's recipes. And the man who once destroyed them both? He sat each day in the same chair by the upstairs window, eyes blank, mouth slightly open, his body thin but alive. Not sick. Not mad. Just hollowed. He did not speak anymore. Not even to Lala. When she passed him, he didn't blink. When the wind rattled the shutters, he didn't flinch. It was as if something inside him had gone too deep into silence to ever return. Some nights, Lala wondered if he still dreamed. If he wandered inside some endless hallway of memory, chased by ghosts that wore no faces but knew his name. She hoped so. She hoped his mind was filled with the scent of the dishes he once choked down. She hoped every bite returned to him in sleep, not to punish but to remind. She never stopped feeding him. Once a day, always warm. Always simple. Bread. A small bowl of lentils. Sometimes just water infused with a root that encouraged honesty, even in silence. He chewed slowly. Always finished. And always stared out the window as if waiting for someone. Maybe her father. Maybe himself. Sometimes visitors asked why she let him live. Lala would smile faintly. He's not living, she'd say. He's remembering. And she would return to the kitchen. To the simmering pots. To the garden bursting with the herbs no one else dared grow. One spring morning, a child from a distant town arrived with her mother. The girl was thin and quiet, her eyes too big for her face. She carried a broken toy in her arms. Her mother said the girl hadn't spoken in months. No tears. No laughter. Just silence. Lala served them both a bowl of stew, light, made with fennel and rosemary and a pinch of dried clove. The girl ate slowly, her spoon barely lifting. Then she stopped, stared into the bowl. And whispered a single word, warm. The mother cried. The child didn't. She just smiled. And Lala, standing behind the counter, felt something settle inside her. Like a bell rung softly. Like a breath finally let go. When the girl left, she left the toy behind. Lala placed it beside her father's journal. She never sold the meals. Only accepted what people offered, stories, seeds, sometimes nothing at all. She had learned from a man who once fed the poor with the same care he gave to kings. And now, when people spoke of her, they didn't say her name first. They said, "Go to the healer's daughter." And that was enough.